Eduardo Campos had worked the night shift at the industrial plant for 6 years. It paid better, 15% more than days, and when he'd started, money had been tight. His wife Terry's father, Gerald Sanchez, had moved in with him 3 years ago after her mother passed. The arrangement seemed practical. Gerald could help with the kids, while Eduardo slept during the day and Terry managed her part-time work at the library. Their son Jake was 9 now, and their daughter Hope was 7. Eduardo pulled into the driveway at 6:30 in the morning, the sky just beginning to brighten. He could hear retching from the bathroom before he even opened the front door. Again, 4th Monday in a row. Terry stood outside the bathroom, her face tight with worry. "It's Jake," she said unnecessarily. Eduardo moved past her and knelt beside his son, who was hunched over the toilet, his small body shaking. When the spasm passed, Jake leaned back against his father's chest, exhausted. "We're taking you to Dr. Hendricks again," Eduardo said quietly. "Dad, I'm fine. It's just, you're not fine. You throw up every Monday morning." Jake's face went pale. "Please don't make me stay home." Eduardo exchanged a look with Terry over their son's head. That was the strangest part. Most kids would love an excuse to miss school, but Jake seemed desperate to go. Dr. Kelvin Hendricks ran the tests again. Blood work, examined Jake's throat and stomach, asked about his diet, stress at school, anything that might explain the pattern. Everything came back normal. Some children develop cyclic vomiting syndrome, Dr. Hendricks said, pushing his glasses up his nose. It can be triggered by stress or anxiety. Is anything happening at school on Mondays? A particular class he doesn't like? A teacher? Jake shook his head vigorously. "I like school. I like all my classes." "What about Sunday nights?" the doctor pressed. "Anything that happens on Sunday evenings that might worry you?" Jake went very still. Eduardo noticed his son's hands gripping the edge of the examination table, knuckles white. "Jake," Eduardo prompted. "Can we just go home?" Jake's voice was small. They drove home in silence. Eduardo glanced in the rearview mirror several times, watching Jake stare out the window. Something was wrong. Something beyond a simple stomach bug or cyclic vomiting syndrome. That evening, Eduardo found Jake in his room, building a Lego spaceship with unusual intensity. He sat down on the floor beside his son. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Jake's hand stilled. "I know. The doctor says you're healthy. But you're sick every Monday morning. I need to understand why." Jake kept his eyes on the Lego pieces. Minutes passed. Eduardo waited, patient despite the knot forming in his stomach. "Daddy," Jake finally whispered, "I don't want to be alone with Grandpa when you work at night." The words hung in the air. Eduardo felt his blood go cold. "What happens when I'm at work?" Jake's hands trembled. "He comes into our rooms. When you're not there. He tells us it's a secret. He says if we tell, you and Mom will be sad and it'll be our fault." Eduardo forced himself to stay calm. Even his rage began building in his chest. "Jake, look at me." His son's eyes met his, wide and frightened. "You did the right thing telling me. You're very brave. Did Grandpa hurt you?" Jake shook his head quickly. "Not me, but Hope." His voice broke. Eduardo's vision narrowed. "Hope." He goes to her room more. "I hear her crying sometimes through the wall. I try to stay awake, try to stop him once, but he got really mad. He grabbed my arm hard and said if I ever interfered again, he'd make sure you lost your job and we'd be homeless. He said it would be my fault if our family fell apart." Eduardo pulled Jake into his arms, holding his son tight while his mind raced. "None of this is your fault. Do you understand me? None of it. You're a kid. This is on him, and only him. Are you going to tell Mom?" Eduardo thought about Terry, about how she defended her father when Eduardo had expressed mild concerns about Gerald's temper, about how she'd insisted they take him in after her mother died. Gerald Sanchez had been careful, Eduardo realized. He'd isolated the children, threatened them, made them complicit in his secret. "Not yet," Eduardo said, "but I'm going to protect you and Hope. I promise you that." That night, after everyone was asleep, Eduardo sat in his darkened living room and made a plan. He couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Jake's disclosure was vague, and Hope hadn't said anything at all. Gerald would deny everything. And Eduardo knew how these cases could drag out, how families could be torn apart by investigations that went nowhere. He needed proof. He needed to catch Gerald in the act. The next morning, Eduardo went to his supervisor of the plant, Craig Vaughn, a gruff man in his 50s who'd always been fair with him. "I need to switch to day shift," Eduardo said. Craig frowned. "You know, day shift means a pay cut. 15%. That's almost $400 a month." "I know. I need to do it anyway." "You got money problems?" "Because." "No. Family situation. I can't explain, but I need days. Starting this week, if possible." Craig studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll make it happen. You're one of my best guys, Campos. If you need days, you got days." Eduardo told Terry that there'd been a shift reorganization at work, budget cuts, they were eliminating some night positions. She accepted the explanation easily. Gerald, eating breakfast at their table, looked up with mild interest. "That's a shame about the pay cut," Gerald said, his voice sympathetic. "But more time with the family, right?" Eduardo met his father-in-law's eyes. Gerald was 62, gray-haired, soft-spoken. He volunteered at the church, helped Terry with grocery shopping, told stories about his career as an insurance adjuster. To anyone watching, he was a devoted grandfather, a helpful presence in the household. "Right," Eduardo said evenly. More time with the family. For the next 2 weeks, Eduardo worked days and came home in the late afternoon. He watched Hope carefully. She was quieter than usual, didn't want to play as much, sometimes flinched when Gerald touched her shoulder. But she didn't say anything. Gerald, for his part, seemed frustrated. He made comments about being tired in the evenings, about how he was used to having his own space at night. Eduardo bided his time. He bought a small digital camera, the kind that could record video in low light. He researched, planned, and waited for his opportunity. It came on a Friday night. Terry mentioned she was taking the church women's group on a weekend retreat. They'd leave Saturday morning and return Sunday afternoon. Gerald wouldn't go. He said those retreats were too much estrogen for him. Perfect. Eduardo told Terry he'd take the kids to his brother's house for the weekend, give Gerald some peace and quiet. She thought it was a wonderful idea. Saturday morning, Eduardo packed bags for Jake and Hope, drove them to his brother Buddy's place across town. Buddy Melton was a mechanic, divorced, living in a small house with his teenage son. Eduardo had called ahead. "I need you to watch the kids tonight," Eduardo said. "Don't ask why, but they stay here no matter what. Even if Terry calls, even if Gerald calls. They stay here until I come get them tomorrow." Buddy looked at his brother's face and nodded slowly. "They're safe here. You do what you need to do." Eduardo went home. Gerald was watching television in the living room. "Where's everyone?" Gerald asked. "Terry's at her retreat. I dropped the kids at my brother's. Thought you could use a quiet house." Gerald smiled. "That's thoughtful. You working tonight?" "No, but I'm meeting some guys from the plant. Poker game. Probably be out late." Eduardo left at 7, drove to a bar across town, nursed a single beer for an hour where the bartender and several regulars could place him. Then he drove to a 24-hour diner, had coffee, made sure the waitress remembered him. By 10:30, he left and drove home, parking 3 blocks away in a residential area where his truck wouldn't stand out. He approached his house on foot, staying in the shadows. The lights were off except for Gerald's bedroom. Eduardo had positioned the camera in Hope's room that morning, hidden in her bookshelf, aimed at the window and bed. He told no one. This was his insurance, his proof. Now he waited in the darkness of his backyard, watching. At 11:30, Gerald's bedroom light went out. Eduardo checked his watch. Midnight came and went. He was beginning to think he'd been wrong, that maybe his presence in the house during the day had changed Gerald's patterns. Then, at 12:15, he saw movement. Gerald, dressed in dark clothes, emerged from the back door. Eduardo pressed himself against the side of the house, barely breathing. Gerald moved with purpose, carrying something, a duffel bag. Eduardo's pulse hammered as Gerald crept around the side of the house to Hope's window. In the shadows, Eduardo watched his father-in-law set down the bag, test the window. It slid open easily. Gerald had done this before, many times. He'd probably unlocked it earlier. Gerald climbed through the window with surprising agility for a man his age. Eduardo counted to 10, then moved silently to the window. He could see Gerald in the dim light from the street lamp, opening the duffel bag. Eduardo slipped in through the back door, keys already in hand, moving through his own house like a ghost. His hands shook with rage, but his mind was crystal clear. He reached Hope's bedroom door and opened it slowly. Gerald was bent over the duffel bag, pulling something out. In the low light, Eduardo could see rope, duct tape, a camera of his own, equipment for documenting his abuse, for creating images and videos to share with others like him, or to keep for himself. Eduardo moved fast. He grabbed Gerald by the collar and yanked him backward. Gerald let out a startled cry, dropping the bag. Eduardo slammed him against the wall, his forearm across the older man's throat. "Dad!" Jake's voice came from the doorway. Eduardo's head snapped around. Jake stood there in his pajamas, breathing hard. He must have slipped in through the front door. Eduardo had given him a key weeks ago, just in case. "Jake, I told you to stay at Uncle Buddy's," Eduardo said, keeping his voice level despite the situation. "I had to see," Jake said. "I had to know I wasn't crazy, that it wasn't my fault." Gerald's face had gone purple. "Eduardo, you don't understand." "Shut up." Eduardo increased the pressure slightly. "Jake, go to the kitchen. Call 911. Tell them your grandfather broke into your house, and there's been a confrontation." "Daddy, don't call the police," Jake said, his voice urgent. "Please." Eduardo turned to his son, confused. "Why not?" Jake stepped fully into the room, and Eduardo saw the look in his 9-year-old son's eyes. Not fear, but something harder, something older than his years. "Because they'll take him away, and he'll get a lawyer, and he'll tell lies," Jake said. "And Hope will have to talk about what he did. Everyone will know, and maybe they won't believe her. I've been reading articles, Dad, on your computer when you're at work. Most of these guys get away with it, or they get a few years, and then they're out." "Jake, we have to do it different," Jake said. "We have to make sure he never hurts anyone again. Not just us. Anyone." Eduardo stared at his son, seeing the child who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who'd spent weeks protecting his sister in the only way he could, by getting sick every Monday, by trying to stay awake and stand guard. Jake had been living with this nightmare, and it had changed him. Gerald made a choking sound. "The boy's crazy. You're hurting me, Eduardo. This is assault." Eduardo's grip tightened. "You broke into my house through a window at midnight with a bag full of—" He glanced at the duffel again, saw more items. Children's clothing. A bottle of something. "Jesus Christ." "Dad," Jake said quietly, "what are you going to do?" Eduardo looked at his father-in-law, at the man who'd sat at his table, who'd smiled at his children, who'd been planning to document his abuse of Hope tonight, who would have used those images for God knew what purpose. "I'm going to make sure he never gets the chance to do this again," Eduardo said. "But we do it right. We do it smart." Eduardo dragged Gerald to the garage, zip-tied his hands and feet, gagged him. Gerald's eyes were wide with terror now, the predator realizing he'd become prey. Eduardo sent Jake back to Buddy's house. His brother called to confirm Jake had arrived safely. Then Eduardo sat in the garage and thought. He couldn't go to the police now. He'd assaulted Gerald, kidnapped him, restrained him. Even with the evidence, a good lawyer would argue Eduardo had gone too far, that this was vigilante justice. Gerald could press charges. The case could get messy. But Jake was right. The legal system often failed victims of child abuse. Charges were hard to prove. Sentences were light. Offenders got out and reoffended. Eduardo had read the statistics too. Late at night, when he couldn't sleep, after Jake's disclosure, he needed a different approach. Something that would ensure Gerald never hurt another child. That would spare Hope from having to testify. That would protect his family. Eduardo made phone calls. First to an old friend from his Army days, Derek Henson, who now worked in private security and had connections to people who specialized in making problems disappear. Not killing. Eduardo wasn't a murderer, but relocating, persuading, applying pressure in ways that were permanent. "I need information on someone," Eduardo said. "Deep background. Everything he's ever done." "How deep?" "Criminal. Especially anything involving kids." There was a pause. "This personal?" "Very. I'll have something by morning." Next, Eduardo called another contact, Christopher Lynch, a former police detective who'd left the force and now worked as a private investigator. Lynch had a reputation for finding things others couldn't or wouldn't. "I need you to search for evidence," Eduardo said. "Computer, phone, any devices. Any photos, videos, communications. Can you do it tonight?" "Whose devices?" "My father-in-law's. He's at my house. He won't be a problem." Lynch was quiet for a moment. "If I find what I think I'm going to find, we need to talk about next steps." "We will. Just find it first." Lynch arrived at 3 in the morning. He went through Gerald's room at Eduardo's house, found his laptop, phone, and a tablet hidden under the mattress. Lynch set up in the kitchen, connecting devices, running programs. His face grew darker as he worked. "Eduardo," Lynch finally said, "you need to see this." Eduardo stood behind Lynch's shoulder and looked at the screen. His stomach turned. Hundreds of images, videos, not just of Hope, of other children, downloaded from the dark web, organized into folders by age and gender. Communications with other predators, trading images, discussing methods, targets. "There's more," Lynch said grimly. He was part of network, at least a dozen other men. "I recognize some of these usernames from cases I worked. These aren't just collectors. They're active predators. Can you identify them?" "Some. Maybe half. But Eduardo, this is FBI territory. This network. Can you give me names and addresses for the ones you can identify?" Lynch looked up at him. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to make sure they all face consequences. Real consequences. This isn't legal. Neither is what they're doing." Lynch hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll need a few hours. But Eduardo, you can still take this to the authorities. With this evidence. And Hope has to testify. Jake has to testify. Our whole family gets dragged through the system while these men get lawyers and plea deals. No, we do this different." By dawn, Eduardo had a list. 7 names, all within a 200-mile radius. 4 married with children of their own. The information Lynch had pulled showed a pattern. These men had been trading images, meeting in person, coordinating. They were organized. Derek called back at 6 a.m. "Your father-in-law has a history. Nothing prosecuted, but complaints. 2 different families, years ago, before he moved to your area. Both cases dropped due to lack of evidence or families declining to press charges. He's careful, but he's been doing this a long time. Can you get documentation? I can get you copies of the police reports, even the sealed ones. Give me 24 hours. Eduardo returned to the garage. Gerald's eyes were red, his face showing the strain of being restrained all night. Eduardo removed the gag. "We're going to have a conversation," Eduardo said quietly. "And you're going to tell me everything." Gerald Sanchez talked. Not at first. At first, he tried to deny, to justify, to manipulate. He told Eduardo he'd misunderstood, that he was just checking on Hope, that the items in the bag were innocent. Eduardo played back the footage from the hidden camera, showed Gerald the images on his own computer that Lynch had found, showed him the communications with other predators, the plans they'd made. Gerald's face crumbled. "I'm sick," he whimpered. "I need help. I'll get treatment. You're not sick," Eduardo said coldly. "You're a predator. You made choices. You planned this. You were careful. That's not sickness. That's evil. What are you going to do to me?" Eduardo pulled up a chair, sat facing Gerald. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me every name you know in your network. Every meeting place, every method of communication, every detail. Then you're going to write a confession, full details of everything you've done, everyone you've hurt. You're going to sign it. And if I don't," Eduardo's smile was without warmth, "then I call the FBI right now. And you know what happens then? This becomes public. Every neighbor, every person at church, everyone who ever knew you learns what you are. Terry learns. And she has to live with the shame of her father being exposed as a child predator. Hope and Jake become the victims everyone knows about. Their whole lives, people will whisper about them." Gerald's face went white. "You wouldn't. Or," Eduardo continued, "you cooperate with me. You confess to everything in writing. You give me the network. And then you disappear. Quietly. Leave the state, cut all contact with the family, never come back. I keep the confession and evidence as insurance. If you ever try to contact us, if you ever hurt another child, I release everything to law enforcement and the media. Your choice. That's not fair. Fair. Eduardo's voice turned to steel. You want to talk about fair? You climbed through my daughter's window at midnight with rope and a camera. You traumatized my son so badly he was vomiting every Monday morning. You were part of a network trading images of abused children. You don't get to talk to me about fair. Over the next 6 hours, Gerald talked. Names spilled out. Spencer Williams, a high school counselor. Nathaniel Wilson, who worked at a youth center. Gene Little, a coach. More names, more details. Gerald described meetings in parking lots, chat rooms, encrypted messages. He'd been part of this network for over a decade. Eduardo recorded every word. Then he had Gerald write it all down, longhand, signed and dated. Lynch documented everything, created multiple copies of all evidence, stored them in different locations. This could put away dozens of predators, Lynch said. Maybe more. It will, Eduardo said. But not through the courts. He called Derek again. I need to move someone out of state. Permanently. Can you arrange that? Depends. How permanently? He needs to disappear from here. Start over somewhere isolated where he has no access to children. And he needs to be monitored for life. If he steps out of line, if he goes near a school or playground, I need to know immediately. That's complicated and expensive. How expensive? $30,000 to set it up. Another $1,000 a month for monitoring. Eduardo thought about his savings, his retirement account, the money he'd been putting away for the kids' college. Done. How fast can you move? 48 hours. Eduardo called his boss, Craig, told him there'd been a family emergency. He needed a few days off. Craig, concerned, granted it immediately. Then Eduardo called Terry. Hi, honey, he said, keeping his voice normal. How's the retreat? It's wonderful. Very peaceful. How are the kids? They're great. Still at Buddy's. Listen, your dad got a call. Old friend from his insurance days. Guy's got a business opportunity in Montana. Needs help for a few months. Your dad's pretty excited about it. He's leaving tomorrow. Tomorrow? That's sudden. Yeah, but you know how he is. Likes to keep busy. He said he'd call you once he gets settled. After he hung up, Gerald stared at him. You're not really letting me go. I'm letting you leave alive and without prosecution, Eduardo said. That's more than you deserve. But you're not getting away. You're going to spend the rest of your life monitored, isolated, in a place where you'll never have access to children again. And if you violate the terms, if you ever try to come back, if you ever harm anyone, the evidence goes to the FBI and every news station in the country. You'll die in prison. What about the others? The network. They're next. Derek's people came Sunday afternoon. They were professionals, ex-military, discreet. They sedated Gerald, transported him in an unmarked van. Eduardo never asked where exactly they were taking him. He didn't care, as long as it was far away and Gerald would be controlled. The monitoring starts immediately, Derek said. Ankle bracelet hidden. GPS tracking, camera surveillance. If he tries to access the internet, we'll know. If he goes near a school, a park, anywhere kids gather, we'll know. And the people watching him, they know what he is. They won't be gentle if he steps out of line. Good. Eduardo paid the fee, watched the van drive away. Then he turned his attention to the list of names Lynch had compiled. He started with Spencer Williams, the high school counselor. Williams worked at a school 40 miles away, well-regarded, trusted by students and parents. According to the evidence Lynch had found, Williams had been abusing his position for years, using his counselor role to access vulnerable teenagers, creating opportunities for private sessions that became assault. Eduardo couldn't just turn the evidence over to the police. If he did, it would raise questions about how he'd obtained it, lead back to Gerald, expose his family. He needed a different approach, one that would neutralize Williams without legal entanglement. He called Buddy. I need help. Legitimate help. No questions. What kind of help? The kind where you do some work on someone's car, and maybe that work isn't as thorough as it should be. Where brakes might fail in a controlled way, nothing fatal, but enough to cause problems. Buddy was quiet. You want me to sabotage someone's vehicle? I want you to make sure someone who hurts children can't hurt them anymore. That's not legal, Eduardo. Neither is what he's doing. Another pause. Who is this person? Eduardo explained, showed Buddy some of the evidence without revealing Hope's involvement. Buddy's face darkened. I've got a friend, Buddy finally said. Jake Austin works at a dealership. He's good at making things look like accidents. But Eduardo, you're walking a dangerous line here. I know. William's car started having problems. First the brakes. They failed while he was pulling into a parking lot, sending him crashing into a light pole at low speed. Then the steering went haywire on the highway, causing him to swerve and get pulled over by police, where he was found to be visibly intoxicated. Never mind that Eduardo had arranged for his drink to be spiked at a bar earlier that evening. Williams got a DUI, lost his driver's license. That would have been enough to inconvenience him. But Eduardo wasn't done. He anonymously sent carefully curated evidence to Williams' employer. Not enough to reveal the full extent of his crimes, but enough to raise serious concerns. Vague references to inappropriate communications with students, suggestions of boundary violations. The school launched an investigation. Williams, stressed and paranoid, started making mistakes. Eduardo watched from a distance as the counselor's life began to unravel. The investigation expanded. More evidence surfaced, planted by Eduardo through anonymous tips, always careful to keep his own hands clean. 3 weeks after Gerald disappeared, Spencer Williams was arrested on multiple counts of inappropriate conduct with minors. The investigation had uncovered enough independent evidence that prosecutors could move forward without Eduardo's involvement. Williams tried to claim he was being framed, but the damage was done. One down. 6 to go. Nathaniel Wilson, the youth center employee, was harder to reach. He was cautious, had good instincts. Eduardo spent 2 weeks surveilling him, learning his patterns. Wilson lived alone, kept irregular hours, used encrypted communications. He wasn't married, had no family ties that Eduardo could exploit. But everyone had weaknesses. Wilson's was pride. He considered himself clever, untouchable. He'd bragged about it in his communications with Gerald and the others. How he'd been operating for 15 years without suspicion. How he'd refined his methods. Eduardo decided to use that arrogance against him. He created a fake online persona, posed as another predator looking to join the network. Using Gerald's credentials, Eduardo gained access to the encrypted chat rooms. He was careful, used the right terminology, showed the right level of caution that these men used to vet each other. Wilson took the bait. He messaged Eduardo's persona, suggesting a meeting to discuss potential opportunities. They arranged to meet in a parking garage at night. Eduardo showed up early, prepared. He'd brought Christopher Lynch and 2 of Lynch's former police colleagues, men who'd left the force but still had connections and resources. When Wilson arrived, they were waiting. Nathaniel Wilson? Lynch flashed a convincing-looking badge. Not real, but close enough in the dim light. FBI, we need to ask you some questions about your online activities. Wilson panicked. He ran. That was exactly what Eduardo had expected. The men gave chase, cornered him. In the struggle, Wilson's phone fell from his pocket. Lynch grabbed it. Got it, Lynch said. This should be interesting. They let Wilson go. They had no authority to detain him anyway. But now they had his phone, and Lynch was an expert at breaking encryption. By morning, they had access to everything. Wilson's communications, his network connections, his stored images. Eduardo anonymously delivered everything to the FBI, not through official channels. That would raise questions, but through a contact Derek had at the Bureau, a cybercrime specialist who asked no questions about the source. 2 weeks later, Nathaniel Wilson was arrested in a coordinated raid. The FBI had taken Eduardo's evidence, followed the leads, built their own independent case. Wilson's arrest led to 3 others in the network. For down. The remaining 3, Gene Little, Barry Vance, and Ron Burt, were more cautious. They'd seen the arrests, knew something was wrong. The network was fragmenting, people going dark. Eduardo shifted tactics. He couldn't get to them directly, but he could turn them against each other. Using his access to Gerald accounts and the recovered communications, Eduardo began sending anonymous messages to each of the remaining men, suggesting that one of the others had been cooperating with law enforcement. He planted seeds of suspicion, forged messages, created evidence of betrayal. Gene Little, the coach, started acting erratically. He thought Ron Burt, the mechanic, had turned informant. Burt thought Barry Vance, a photographer, was the leak. Vance suspected both of them. The paranoia spread like poison. Little made a mistake. In his panic, he tried to destroy evidence, but he did it stupidly, throwing a computer in a dumpster behind his apartment. Eduardo had been watching, had anticipated this. He anonymously called in a suspicious activity report. Police searched the dumpster, found a computer. What they discovered on it was damning. Gene Little was arrested. Under pressure, facing decades in prison, he provided information on the others. Barry Vance went down next. Ron Burt lasted another month before police raided his home, finding evidence that connected him to the network. 7 for 7. Every name on Eduardo's list was either arrested, under investigation, or, in Gerald's case, permanently removed from society. Eduardo picked up Jake and Hope from Buddy's house. They'd been staying there on and off for weeks, though Eduardo had made sure they had play dates, normal activities, time with their mother. Terry had been confused by Gerald's sudden departure to Montana, but she'd accepted it. Gerald called once a week, supervised calls arranged through Derek's people, to maintain the fiction. Now, sitting in Buddy's living room, Eduardo looked at his children. Hope was quiet, as she'd been for months. Jake was watching his father with those two old eyes. Is Grandpa gone? Jake asked. Yes. Forever. Forever. Hope spoke up, her voice small. Will he come back? No, sweetheart. He can't. And he can't hurt you anymore. What about the other bad people? Jake pressed. The ones he knew? Eduardo glanced at Buddy, who was pretending not to listen from the kitchen. They can't hurt anyone anymore either. Some of them are in jail. Others will be soon. Did you do that? Eduardo chose his words carefully. I made sure the right people found out what they were doing. I made sure there was evidence. And I made sure justice happened. That's not what the police do, Jake said. He was too smart, this kid. Too aware. The police follow rules. Sometimes the rules aren't enough. Will you get in trouble? I don't know, Eduardo admitted. Maybe, but keeping you safe was more important than following rules that don't work. Hope climbed into Eduardo's lap, buried her face in his chest. I'm glad he's gone, she whispered. I was so scared. Eduardo held his daughter, felt her small body shake with silent sobs. The first tears she'd shed since this all began. Jake moved closer, and Eduardo pulled him in too, holding both his children. I'm sorry, Hope said. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. This was not your fault. Not even a little bit. They sat like that for a long time. Buddy eventually brought hot chocolate, set mugs on the table, quietly left the room. Eduardo let his children cry, let them release the fear and trauma they'd been carrying. When they'd finally settled, Jake looked up. Is Mom going to find out? That was the question Eduardo had been dreading. I don't know. Maybe eventually. Will she be mad? Probably. At me, not at you. What are you going to tell her? The truth. Just not yet. Not until you're both ready. 2 months passed. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Hope started smiling again, playing with friends, sleeping through the night. Jake's Monday morning vomiting stopped completely. They both started seeing a therapist. Eduardo found a woman, Dr. Carrie Watkins, who specialized in childhood trauma and didn't ask too many questions about the circumstances. The arrests continued to make news. The network's dismantling was described as a major FBI operation, a years-long investigation. Eduardo saw Spencer Williams' photo on the news, saw the charges stacking up. Nathaniel Wilson had been denied bail. Gene Little was cooperating with prosecutors, giving up others in exchange for a reduced sentence. Eduardo felt no guilt. He destroyed lives, yes, but they were lives that deserved destroying. These men had hurt children, had planned to hurt more. He'd stopped them in a way the legal system couldn't or wouldn't. But there were consequences. Christopher Lynch called him one evening, voice tense. We need to talk. In person. They met at a diner on the outskirts of town. Lynch looked worried. The FBI is asking questions, Lynch said, about the sources of some of the evidence in these cases. They're trying to figure out how so much information appeared from nowhere all at once. They're looking for a connection. Will they find one? Not if we're careful. But Eduardo, you need to stop. No more vigilante justice. You've done enough. If you keep pushing, they'll figure out. I'm done, Eduardo said. The network is destroyed. Gerald is gone. That was the goal. Good. Because there's something else. Lynch pulled out a folder. Derek's monitoring reports on Gerald. Your father-in-law tried to access the internet last week. Tried to find a way around the restrictions. Eduardo's jaw tightened. What happened? Derek's people stopped him. Gave him a warning. But Gerald's testing boundaries. He's going to be a problem. Then we make sure he understands the consequences. Ow! Eduardo thought about the confession, the evidence, the documentation he'd carefully preserved. We remind him what happens if he doesn't comply. That night, Eduardo called the number Derek had given him for emergencies. A rough voice answered. I need you to deliver a message to Gerald Sanchez, Eduardo said. Tell him if he violates the agreement again, everything goes public. Not just to the FBI, to every news outlet in the country. I want him to understand that his compliance isn't optional. Consider it done. Terry noticed the changes in Hope and Jake. Her daughter was happy again, laughing, playing. Her son was relaxed, sleeping better. She commented on it one evening while Eduardo did dishes. It's like they're different kids, she said. Like a weight's been lifted. Maybe it has. Do you think it was Dad being here? Maybe they were stressed by having him around. Eduardo's hands stilled in the soapy water. Here was the opening. He could tell her everything right now. But he looked at her face, tired from work, content with how the children were doing, and he couldn't bring himself to destroy her world. Maybe, he said noncommittally. I talked to Dad yesterday. He sounds happy in Montana. Says the work is good, keeping him busy. I'm glad he found something to do. But I miss him. Eduardo said nothing. Let her believe what she needed to believe. For now. But Jake was watching from the doorway, and when Eduardo met his son's eyes, Jake gave a small nod. He understood. They both understood. Sometimes protecting someone meant lying to them. Sometimes the truth was too heavy to share. 6 months later, Eduardo received a call from Derek. Gerald Sanchez is dead. Eduardo's grip on the phone tightened. Ow! Heart attack. Natural causes verified by a doctor. He'd been having chest pains for weeks, didn't report them. Died in his sleep last night. Eduardo sat down heavily. You're sure it was natural? I'm sure. We had cameras, remember? He went to bed, didn't wake up. Could have been stress, could have been genetics, could have been karma. But it wasn't our people. After hanging up, Eduardo sat in silence. He should feel something. Relief, satisfaction, closure. But mostly he just felt tired. He told Terry that evening. She cried, of course. Wanted to bring the body back for burial. Eduardo convinced her that Gerald had wanted to be cremated, had made arrangements in Montana, wanted a simple memorial there. She accepted this, planned a small service at their church instead. At the service, friends and church members spoke about Gerald. What a kind man he'd been, how helpful, how devoted to his grandchildren. Eduardo stood there, listened to them praise a monster, and said nothing. Hope held his hand tightly. Jake stood on his other side, face impassive. Afterward, at home, Terry looked through old photos of her father. Eduardo watched her grieve for a man she'd thought she knew. You should tell her, Jake said quietly that night. He'd appeared in Eduardo's room after Terry had gone to sleep. She deserves to know who he really was. Maybe, but not yet. When she's ready. When you and Hope are older. When enough time has passed that it won't destroy her. It's not fair to her, letting her believe a lie. No, it's not. But sometimes being kind means protecting people from truths they can't handle. Jay considered this. Is that why you did everything? To protect us? Yes. Even illegal stuff? Even hurting people? Eduardo looked at his son. This 9-year-old who'd been forced to become something more, something harder. Yes. I would do anything to protect you and Hope. Anything. The law is supposed to protect children, but sometimes it fails. Sometimes people fall through the cracks. Sometimes monsters hide in plain sight, and the system can't touch them. So yes, I broke the law, and I'd do it again. Will you tell me when I'm older? Everything you did. If you want to know. Jake nodded slowly, processing. I think what you did was right. Maybe not legal, but right. Grandpa hurt Hope. He would have kept hurting her. And those other men, they would have hurt more kids. You stopped them. I did. Are you going to get caught? I don't think so. I was careful. But it's possible. If you do, if you go to jail, will Hope and me be okay? Eduardo pulled Jake into a hug. You'll be okay. Buddy will take care of you. And your mother. You're strong, Jake. Stronger than you should have to be. But you'll survive, no matter what. 2 years passed. No investigation ever led to Eduardo. The network's destruction was credited to FBI cybercrime units and good police work. Eduardo returned to his life. Working days now, coming home to his family, watching his children grow up without the shadow of abuse hanging over them. Hope flourished. She joined the school theater program, made friends, became a kid again. The nightmares faded. Dr. Watkins said she was processing the trauma in healthy ways, that with time and support, she'd be okay. Jake was different. He'd always be different. Eduardo saw it in the way his son watched the world, evaluated people, understood motivations and deceptions. The experience had changed him fundamentally. But he was still a good kid, kind to his sister, protective, smart. He just saw reality more clearly than most 11-year-olds. Terry never learned the truth. Eduardo and the kids maintained the fiction, let her believe her father had died peacefully in Montana, working and happy. It was a kindness, Eduardo told himself, a lie that protected her from pain. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, Eduardo thought about the choices he'd made. The men he'd destroyed, the laws he'd broken, the lines he'd crossed. He thought about Gerald, dying alone in a monitored facility far from home. About Spencer Williams and Nathaniel Wilson and the others sitting in prison cells. He felt no regret. These were predators who'd chosen their victims carefully, who'd hidden behind respectability, who'd caused immeasurable harm. Eduardo had simply ensured they faced consequences. Real consequences. Was he a vigilante? Yes. A criminal? Technically. But he was also a father who'd protected his children when the system failed them. And he'd do it again in a heartbeat. One evening, Jake found Eduardo in the garage, organizing tools. Dad, can I ask you something? Always. Do you think Grandpa was sorry? Before he died, do you think he felt bad about what he did? Eduardo considered the question carefully. I don't know. Some people are capable of remorse. Others aren't. They just feel sorry for themselves for getting caught or facing consequences. I think your grandfather was probably the second type. So he never would have stopped on his own. No, he would have kept hurting people until someone stopped him. Then you did the right thing. I did what I had to do. Jake nodded, accepting this. When I'm older, I want to help people like you did. Maybe not the same way. Maybe I'll be a cop or a lawyer or something. But I want to protect kids who can't protect themselves. Because I know what it's like to be scared and helpless and think no one will believe you. Eduardo felt his throat tighten. You'll make a difference, Jake. I know you will. Will you teach me? How to be smart like you. How to plan and think ahead. I'll teach you everything I know. They stood in the garage, father and son, and Eduardo realized that from the ashes of trauma, something was being built. Jake would take the lessons from this nightmare and use them for good. He'd be stronger, more aware, more capable than most. The abuse hadn't broken him. It had forged him. That didn't make what happened okay. Nothing could make it okay. But at least something positive would come from the darkness. 3 years after Gerald's death, Eduardo was cleaning out the garage when he found a box he'd forgotten about. Backup copies of all the evidence, Gerald's confession, documentation of everything that had happened. He sat on the concrete floor, reading through it all. Terry appeared in the doorway. What's that? Eduardo's mind raced. He could hide it, deflect, or he could finally tell her the truth. Sit down, he said. We need to talk. She sat, confused. Eduardo took a deep breath. Your father didn't die of a heart attack in Montana working on a business deal. He's dead, yes, that part's true. But the rest, I need to tell you what really happened. He told her everything. About Jake's disclosure, Hope's abuse, the network, the evidence, what he'd done to protect their children. He showed her the documentation, let her read Gerald's confession in his own handwriting. Terry's face went through stages. Disbelief, denial, horror, rage, grief. She read Gerald's words, saw the evidence, and her hand shook. My father, she couldn't finish the sentence, was a predator. I'm sorry. I know that's. You knew for 3 years? You let me mourn him? Let me think. She was crying now, angry tears. How could you not tell me? I was protecting the kids. They'd been through enough without having to watch you fall apart. That wasn't your decision to make. Yes, it was. I'm their father. Protecting them is always my decision. They fought. Terry raged, demanded to know every detail, wanted to understand how she'd missed the signs. She was furious with Eduardo for keeping secrets, furious with herself for being blind, devastated by her father's betrayal. But underneath the anger, Eduardo saw relief. Relief that her children were safe. Relief that the monster was gone. Relief that Eduardo had handled it, had protected them all. What you did, she finally said, voice hoarse from crying. Taking him, threatening him, manipulating those other men, that's illegal. It's what had to be done. You could go to jail. Maybe. Is that what you want? For me to turn myself in? Terry looked at him, this man she'd married, the father of her children. She thought about what he'd done, the laws he'd broken, the lines he'd crossed. And she thought about what would have happened if he hadn't acted. How many more times Hope would have been hurt? How many other children those men would have abused? No, she said finally. You protected our family. That's what matters. 5 years after Gerald's disappearance, Jake was 14, Hope was 12. They were normal kids with normal problems. Homework, friends, sports, drama. The trauma hadn't vanished, but it had been processed, healed as much as trauma could heal. Eduardo and Terry were stronger than ever. The secret had been shared, the burden distributed. They went to counseling together, worked through the complexity of what had happened. One evening, the family sat down for dinner, something they made a point of doing every night. Jake and Hope bickered about whose turn it was to do dishes. Eduardo and Terry exchanged amused looks. Jake, you're up tonight, Eduardo said. That's not fair. I did them last night. Because you lost the coin toss, remember? Hope grinned triumphantly. Normal sibling rivalry. Beautiful in its ordinariness. After dinner, Hope pulled Eduardo aside. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. I don't really remember everything that happened. With Grandpa, I mean, Dr. Watkins says that's normal, that my brain is protecting me. But Jake remembers. And sometimes I feel bad that I don't remember how you saved us. Eduardo knelt down to his daughter's level. You don't need to remember. You just need to be happy and healthy and safe. That's enough. But I want to thank you for stopping him, for making sure he couldn't hurt me anymore. Eduardo hugged her tight. You're welcome, sweetheart. You never have to thank me for protecting you. That's what fathers do. After she went upstairs, Terry came to stand beside Eduardo. You did good, she said quietly. We did good. All of us. Do you have any regrets? Eduardo thought about Gerald, about the other men, about the laws broken and lines crossed. No, not one. Terry took his hand. Neither do I. 10 years later, Jake graduated college with a degree in criminal justice. He'd kept his promise to himself. He wanted to protect children, wanted to work in a system that, despite its flaws, was necessary. But he'd learned from his father's example. Sometimes the system wasn't enough. Sometimes justice required someone willing to step outside the rules. At Jake's graduation, Eduardo watched his son accept his diploma and felt pride surge through him. This remarkable young man, who'd been victimized as a child but had refused to let that define him, who'd turned his pain into purpose. Hope was in her sophomore year, studying psychology. She wanted to work with trauma victims, wanted to help others heal the way she'd been helped. She was bright, compassionate, strong. After the ceremony, Jake approached his father. I got a job offer, he said. FBI, Cybercrime Division. They want me to start in 2 months. Eduardo felt a chill. The FBI? Yeah, specifically, their unit that tracks online predators and child exploitation networks. Apparently, I did really well in my interviews. They think I have the right temperament for it. Jake, I know what you're thinking, but Dad, this is what I want. I'm going to finish what you started. All those networks out there, all those men like Grandpa, I'm going to help take them down. Legally this time, but I'm going to be relentless. Eduardo looked at his son, 24 now, tall and confident and determined. You're sure? I'm sure. You showed me that evil hides in plain sight. That predators count on people being too afraid or too confused to act. But I'm not afraid, and I know exactly what I'm looking for. Eduardo pulled Jake into a hug. I'm proud of you. Your grandfather, what he did, what I did, none of that was your fault. You don't have to spend your life fighting because of what happened. I'm not fighting because of what happened to me, Jake said. I'm fighting because of what happens to other kids every day. Because I can make a difference, just like you did. As Eduardo watched his children celebrate, surrounded by friends and family, he realized that this was the true victory. Not the destruction of Gerald and his network. That had been necessary, but it was a response to evil, not a triumph over it. The real triumph was this: two healthy, strong, purposeful young people who'd survived trauma and become better for it, who'd taken the worst experience of their childhood and transformed it into motivation to protect others. Gerald Sanchez had tried to destroy them. Instead, he created two people who would spend their lives ensuring other predators face justice. That was the ultimate revenge. Not violence, not even legal prosecution, but taking victims and turning them into warriors. Eduardo had broken laws, crossed lines, done things most people would condemn. But looking at Jake and Hope now, seeing who they'd become, he knew every choice had been worth it. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to become the monster the monsters feared. And Eduardo Campos had no regrets. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.